The little black girl begged the biker, saying a shredded sleeve of her mom was found near a forbidden corridor. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a stormy afternoon in a small town in Nebraska when the sound of heavy boots echoed through the door of a local biker bar. The man who entered was Jack, the leader of a well-known motorcycle club called the Iron Wolves. He was a man of few words, his face weathered and tough from years of riding through both battlefields and backroads. But today, his expression was different. It was one of urgency. The rain poured down outside, but the storm brewing inside the bar was far worse. Jack had just received a call that would change everything. A young black girl had come into the bar, her small face stained with tears. She was trembling as she approached him, holding a piece of cloth in her hands, a shredded sleeve. "Please help me, mister. They took my mom," she cried. Jack felt his heart tighten. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing like this. He looked down at the piece of fabric in her hands, and his gut twisted. It was a part of a shirt, torn and frayed. The girl's words didn't make sense at first. "Where did you find this?" Jack asked, kneeling to her level. She pointed toward the entrance of the bar, shaking. "Near the forbidden corridor. It's where no one dares go. My mom, she's gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. The forbidden corridor. It was a place in the town, a dark alley where many stories had ended poorly. People had whispered about it for years, but no one dared to go near. The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing bad was supposed to happen. But now, the girl's mother had gone missing, and all signs pointed to that forsaken place. Jack stood up slowly, scanning the room. The other bikers in the bar had gathered around, sensing that something big was happening. They were family, every single one of them. Jack didn't have to say a word. They all knew what needed to be done. The promise Jack had made to protect the helpless came rushing back. He had made that promise years ago to his best friend, Tyrone, when he swore to protect his daughter if anything ever happened to him. He couldn't turn his back now. The girl's sobs were louder, more desperate. "Please, you have to help me. My mom is in trouble, and I don't know where else to go." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "We're going to help you. I promise. You're not alone." As Jack turned to face his crew, he could feel the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was personal. They were about to face something far darker than they had imagined, but nothing would stop them from keeping the promise Jack had made long ago. The engines of the motorcycles roared to life as the group gathered in the parking lot, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The girl's mother was out there, somewhere, and they were going to find her. As Jack and his crew of Iron Wolves fired up their engines and roared out of the bar parking lot, the rain fell harder, streaking across the windshield, blurring their vision. The streets were empty, save for a few streetlights flickering overhead. They rode in silence, the weight of the situation heavy on their minds. The small black girl had shown them a piece of her mother's torn shirt, and with it, the kind of desperation no one should ever have to witness. The group's motorcycles thundered through the small town of Rivorton, a place that had always seemed quiet and peaceful, but tonight felt anything but. As they made their way to the edge of town, where the forbidden corridor awaited, Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to his promise to Tyrone, the promise he'd made years ago. It wasn't just about helping a young girl now. It was about honoring the memory of his fallen friend. Jack knew he couldn't fail. Not again. The corridor the girl spoke of wasn't just any alley. It was a narrow, dark passageway, bordered by abandoned buildings on both sides, and whispered about in hushed tones by the townsfolk. People said it was cursed, that strange things happened there, and anyone who wandered too close was bound to find trouble. Jack wasn't one to put stock in local superstitions, but tonight, he wasn't so sure. The closer they got to the corridor, the heavier the air felt. Every member of the Iron Wolves felt it, the tension, the unspoken understanding that they were about to face something far darker than just a missing person. The girl's words kept ringing in Jack's mind. "They took my mom." He gripped the handlebars of his bike tighter, his knuckles turning white. A few minutes later, they arrived at the entrance of the forbidden corridor. The area was eerily quiet, the streetlights barely illuminating the dark shadows between the crumbling buildings. Jack motioned for his crew to stop, and they all dismounted. "Keep your eyes open," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're walking into." The group moved cautiously, their boots echoing against the cold pavement. They could hear the distant sound of water dripping, the only noise that broke the silence. The further they ventured down the corridor, the more oppressive it felt. Jack's senses were on high alert. Something was off. He could feel it in his gut. "It's too quiet," said one of the bikers, a tall man named Vince. "I don't like this." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "We keep moving forward." As they pressed on, they passed a series of dilapidated buildings, their windows boarded up, their doors either broken or chained shut. The place felt abandoned, like the town itself had forgotten it even existed. But Jack knew better. No one in this town went near the corridor unless they had no other choice. The rain kept falling, turning the ground into a slick, dangerous mess. Jack could feel the weight of the girl's story pressing down on him, like a constant reminder of the promise he made. They reached the end of the corridor, where an old warehouse stood, its doors rusted and barely hanging on their hinges. This was it, the place the girl had described. This was where her mother was. Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is it," he said, signaling for the crew to stop. The moment they arrived, a man stepped out from the shadows, his face partially obscured by a hood. His voice was low and gravelly, like he had been smoking for years. "You shouldn't be here," he said, eyeing the group of bikers. Jack didn't flinch. "We're here for the girl's mother," he said, his voice unwavering. "She's missing. We know she's in there." The man didn't move, but there was a shift in his stance, as if he was weighing his options. "You've made a mistake," he finally said. "Leave now, or there will be consequences." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he said coldly. The tension in the air thickened, but Jack wasn't about to back down. Not when a child's safety was on the line. The man stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he warned. But it was too late. Jack and his crew weren't going anywhere without answers. They were ready for whatever came next. As they pushed past him, the man hesitated, then quickly disappeared into the shadows, leaving them at the threshold of the dark, foreboding warehouse. Jack took one final glance at his crew, then led the way inside. The rain had stopped, but the storm was far from over. The warehouse door creaked as Jack pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space like a warning. The musty air hit them first, stale and damp, thick with the scent of old wood and rusted metal. The dim light from the street lamps outside barely filtered in through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Jack's crew filed in behind him, their footsteps silent but purposeful. The tension was palpable. They had arrived, but the real danger was just beginning. The man who had stepped aside earlier had disappeared into the darkness, leaving them to face whatever lay ahead. "Stay alert," Jack muttered, scanning the room with sharp eyes. His crew, as tough as they were, knew better than to underestimate the danger they could be walking into. The Iron Wolves had faced threats from every corner of the world, but this felt different, more personal, somehow. They had no idea what had happened to the girl's mother, but Jack knew this wasn't a simple missing persons case. It never was. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the floor creaking beneath their boots. The air was thick with dust, the dim lights flickering as they passed. There were stacks of old crates piled high, some toppled over, their contents spilling out onto the floor. Every corner seemed to hold more secrets. The smell of oil, metal, and decay was overwhelming. As they reached the far end of the warehouse, Jack saw something that made his stomach drop, an old wooden door, slightly ajar. A faint light bled through the gap, illuminating the dark room beyond. He motioned for his crew to stop. "This is it," he whispered. "We're not alone." They approached the door with caution, their movements slow and deliberate. Jack reached for the handle, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned it. The door opened with a loud groan, revealing a small room filled with old furniture, boxes, and discarded belongings. But what caught Jack's attention wasn't the clutter. It was the woman lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. She was thin, pale, her skin almost translucent in the low light. Her clothes were torn, and there was a bruise forming on her face. Her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. "This is her," one of the bikers, Vince, said as he knelt down to check her pulse. "She's barely hanging on." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched beside her. This was the girl's mother, the woman they had come to save. But there was no time to waste. They needed to get her out of here. "We need to move her, now," Jack ordered. But as he reached to lift her, he noticed something that made him freeze. A shredded sleeve. The same kind of fabric the girl had shown him earlier. Jack's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but there were more questions than answers. Who had done this to her? And why was she left here to die? Before Jack could voice his concerns, the door to the room slammed shut behind them. A figure stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. The room seemed to close in, the air growing colder. "I told you to leave." The man's voice was gravelly, filled with menace. Jack stood up slowly, meeting the man's gaze. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he said firmly. The man didn't flinch, but Jack saw the tension in his posture. He was ready for a fight. "You should have left when you had the chance," the man growled, stepping closer. "Now, you'll pay for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Without warning, the man lunged at Jack, but the biker was faster. He grabbed the man by the wrist, twisting it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The rest of the crew moved in, ready to subdue the threat. But as Jack looked down at the man, he realized something. The fear in his eyes wasn't from Jack's strength. It was from something else, something more dangerous. "Tell me who you're working for," Jack demanded, his voice low and steady. The man gritted his teeth, refusing to answer. Jack could feel the heat of the moment building, the tension between them crackling in the air. Then, the man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know who you're messing with. Let her go, or you'll regret it." Jack's grip tightened. "I'm not going anywhere without answers. Who's behind this? Who's making the calls?" The man hesitated, his face contorting in fear and defiance. Then, with a sudden move, he pulled something from his pocket, a knife. Jack reacted instantly, knocking the weapon from his hand, but the man managed to scramble to his feet. "You don't understand. This isn't just about her. This is bigger than you think." Jack's mind raced. What had they stumbled into? This wasn't just a case of a missing woman. It was something much darker, something that reached further than Riverton. Before he could press the man further, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Jack, we've got company," Vince called, his eyes wide with alarm. Jack turned just in time to see several more figures emerge from the darkness, armed and ready for a fight. The storm was about to get much worse. The figures emerging from the darkness were like shadows brought to life, their faces obscured, their movements swift and deliberate. Jack's instincts screamed at him to act, but he held his ground, his body tense with readiness. The rest of his crew wasn't far behind, their boots clicking on the concrete floor as they quickly formed a defensive circle. The man they had just subdued was still on the ground, his fear palpable. But Jack didn't take his eyes off the approaching figures. "We don't have time for this," Jack muttered under his breath. He knew the stakes were rising higher with each passing second. The man who had warned them earlier had been right. This wasn't just about one woman. This was something much more dangerous. The figures drew closer, revealing more details. There were 5 of them, all wearing dark clothing, their faces hidden under hoods and scarves. Jack could see the glint of weapons in their hands, guns, knives, and even a crowbar. They weren't here to talk. They were here to fight. Jack's hand instinctively reached for his own weapon, a heavy wrench that he had used countless times, both as a mechanic and as a weapon when the situation called for it. He could feel the cold weight of it in his hand as his grip tightened. "You should have stayed out of it," one of the men said, his voice harsh and clipped, the words carrying an unmistakable threat. "Now you've stepped into something you can't walk away from." Jack didn't flinch. "We're not going anywhere without her," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Move out of the way, or we'll move you." The man in the front sneered, stepping forward as the others flanked him. "You're out of your depth, biker," the man said, his hand slowly reaching for the gun at his side. Jack's crew tensed, but he held up a hand. He didn't want to escalate this further. "Not yet. We don't want trouble," Jack said, his voice low but commanding. "We're here to get the woman and leave. That's all. Let us go, and no one gets hurt." The man laughed bitterly. "You think you can just walk in here and take what you want? This is our turf. This is our town." Jack's patience was wearing thin. "I don't care about your turf," he said, taking a step forward. I care about keeping a promise. To a friend. And that's something you're not going to stand in the way of. The tension in the room was thick, like the calm before a storm. The group of bikers stood their ground, their eyes locked on the 5 men who had surrounded them. For a moment, it seemed like time had slowed, the world holding its breath. Then, the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, loud, rapid, and unmistakably approaching. "Jack, we've got company," Vince called out, his voice urgent. Jack turned sharply to see more figures appearing at the far end of the warehouse. These new arrivals were not just men. They were armed, heavily armed, with rifles slung over their shoulders. This was no longer a simple confrontation. They were in the middle of something far bigger than they could have imagined. "They're not here for us," one of the bikers muttered under his breath. "We're just a distraction." Jack didn't waste time. "We need to move. Now." He turned to the man who had been subdued earlier, his expression hard. "Where is she? Where is the girl's mother?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting around, but Jack's grip on his shirt tightened, making him speak. "Down the hall," he finally said, his voice trembling. "But you won't get far. They'll be waiting." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he nodded to his crew. "Let's go," he said. "And stay close. No one gets left behind." The bikers moved swiftly, pushing past the armed men who had gathered in front of them, determined to reach the room where the woman was being held. Jack led the way, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be waiting for them down that hall. Were they walking into a trap? Or would they find the woman, the girl's mother, and get out before it was too late? The hallway stretched out before them, dark and narrow, the walls covered in grime and old graffiti. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, each step bringing them closer to their goal. As they approached the end of the hallway, Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. There was something off about this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then, they reached a heavy metal door. Jack didn't hesitate. He reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and mildew. And there, lying on the floor, was the girl's mother. She was barely conscious, her face pale and bruised, but alive. Jack moved quickly, kneeling beside her. "We've got you," he whispered, his voice soft but steady. "We're taking you home." But as he lifted her into his arms, he heard a sound behind him, a door slamming shut. They weren't alone. Again, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, cutting off their only exit. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he turned around, his grip tightening on the woman he had just lifted into his arms. His crew immediately spread out, scanning the room for threats. The dim light from the flickering bulb overhead barely illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The sound of the door locking echoed in the silence. "We're trapped," Vince muttered, his voice low but filled with urgency. Jack didn't respond immediately, his focus shifting between the woman in his arms and the men now closing in on them from the far side of the room. They were outnumbered, but Jack knew the Iron Wolves weren't the type to back down. He quickly assessed the situation. There were at least 7 of them now, all armed, with 2 blocking the exit. "We're not going anywhere," Jack growled. His eyes flickered to the woman. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, but she was still alive. That was all that mattered. "Take care of her," he told Vince, his voice clipped. "Get her out of here if you can. The rest of us will hold them off." Vince nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He wasn't about to leave Jack to fight alone. "We'll be back for you," Vince said, his tone determined. The crew moved quickly. Jack felt the weight of the moment settle in. Every instinct told him this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was about protecting something far bigger than any one of them. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, the enemies closing in. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the heavy wrench at his side. The others were armed too, some with pipes, others with makeshift weapons, but none of them were backing down. They had made a promise to the girl, and Jack was going to keep it. "Let her go," one of the men barked, his voice cold, unyielding. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "I'm taking her, and I'm leaving with her. You're not standing in my way." The man smirked, a cruel expression on his face. "You really think you can? Just walk out of here." He motioned to the others, who slowly began to circle around Jack and his crew. Jack tightened his grip on the wrench, his body coiled like a spring. The tension in the room was palpable. "You're making a mistake," Jack said, barely above a whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Without warning, one of the men lunged at Jack, a crowbar raised high. Jack sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it, forcing him to drop the weapon. A crack echoed through the room as the man's wrists snapped under the pressure. He cried out in pain, but Jack didn't stop. He tossed the man aside and turned to face the others. "Move back," Jack warned, his voice low and menacing. The rest of the crew had already taken their positions, ready for a fight. Jack's heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. The woman in his arms needed them to get out, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. The tension broke as the group of attackers surged forward, each man armed and ready to strike. But Jack and his crew were faster, more determined. They fought with a ferocity that came from years of loyalty to one another, from a shared sense of purpose. It wasn't just about protecting themselves, it was about protecting the innocent. Jack swung the wrench, catching one of the men across the face, sending him crashing to the ground. Another came at him from behind, but Jack turned just in time, landing a solid punch to his jaw. The man stumbled back, disoriented, but Jack wasn't done. The remaining attackers hesitated, realizing they were outmatched. Jack's crew wasn't just a group of bikers. They were a family, and families didn't back down. "Last chance," Jack growled, his eyes scanning the room. "Get out of my way, and no one else gets hurt." The men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. They knew they couldn't win this fight, not with Jack and his crew in full force. Slowly, the attackers began to retreat, their hands raised in surrender. Jack didn't take his eyes off them until they were out of sight, disappearing into the shadows from where they had come. As the last of the men fled, Jack turned back to Vince, who was still kneeling by the woman's side. Vince had managed to get her to her feet, but she was weak, barely able to stand on her own. "We need to get out of here," Vince said urgently. Jack nodded, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But they had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. "Let's go," Jack said, his voice firm. With the woman still in Vince's care, Jack led the way to the back of the warehouse, where an old service door creaked open with a rusty groan. The night air hit them like a wave, cool and refreshing, but the danger wasn't over. Jack's heart still raced, his senses on high alert. They were out, but now they had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to stop, not yet. The cold night air hit Jack's face as he led the group of bikers through the back door of the warehouse. The woman, barely conscious, was still cradled in Vince's arms. She had begun to stir, but she was weak, and every step seemed to take a toll on her. Jack could feel his heart pounding as he led them through the dark alley behind the building, the weight of the moment heavier than ever. The rain had stopped, but the air still held that damp, oppressive feeling. They had made it out of the warehouse, but Jack knew this wasn't the end. They couldn't stop yet. They had to keep moving. Vince looked at Jack, his face hard with determination. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Jack glanced around, scanning the alley for any signs of danger. "We need to get her to safety. We'll head for the old cabin up on Ridge Road. It's secluded, and no one knows it like we do." Vince nodded, and the rest of the crew fell into step behind them. The woman, now conscious but still dazed, was murmuring softly to herself, her eyes fluttering open and closed. "It's going to be okay," Vince reassured her. Jack's eyes were sharp as they walked, constantly on alert for any sign of trouble. He wasn't sure if they had been followed, but he knew it wasn't a risk they could afford. The sound of footsteps behind them made him freeze. He turned to face the direction of the noise, his instincts immediately kicking in. "We've got company," he muttered. The rest of the bikers quickly spread out, taking cover behind nearby dumpsters and alley walls, weapons drawn and ready. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. A group of figures appeared from around the corner, walking toward them slowly. They weren't alone. More were coming from the other end of the alley. Jack's hand instinctively went to the handle of his wrench. This wasn't just a random group of people. These were the men who had been after the woman. He could see it in their eyes. "Stay behind me," Jack said, his voice low and commanding. Vince carefully adjusted the woman in his arms, trying to shield her as much as possible. "Jack, we can't keep running," Vince replied, his voice firm. We need to end this, now. Jack's eyes met Vince's, and he could see the resolve in his friend's face. They were in this together, and they weren't backing down. Jack nodded, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. He turned to face the approaching group, his grip on his wrench tightening. The leader of the group, a man with a scar running down his cheek, stopped a few paces away from Jack. He looked the biker up and down, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "You really think you can keep running?" the man asked, his voice dripping with malice. "This town doesn't belong to you. You should have stayed out of it." Jack didn't flinch. "This isn't your town either," he said, his voice calm but filled with anger. "You're not taking her. We're walking out of here, and if you try to stop us, I'll make sure you regret it." The man's eyes narrowed as he glanced at his men, who were now closing in from both sides. Jack's crew was outnumbered, but they weren't afraid. They had been through worse. Jack took a step forward, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. "Move aside," he warned. The man laughed, stepping closer to Jack. "You think you can intimidate me?" he asked. "You're in way over your head, biker." Without warning, the man lunged at Jack, aiming to knock the wrench out of his hand. But Jack was faster. He sidestepped the attack and swung the wrench, catching the man in the ribs. The man grunted in pain but quickly regained his footing. The rest of the attackers moved in, and chaos erupted in the alley. Jack swung the wrench again, knocking another man to the ground. The sounds of shouting and grunts filled the air as the fight broke out. Vince moved quickly, pushing the woman toward the safety of the alley wall. "Stay down," he urged her, his voice filled with urgency. As the fight raged on, Jack and his crew held their ground, determined to protect the woman at all costs. Jack's eyes locked onto the leader of the group, the man who had tried to make him back down. He had no intention of letting him get away. With one swift movement, Jack swung his wrench, landing a solid blow to the man's shoulder. The man staggered back, his eyes filled with pain and disbelief. "You're done," Jack said coldly. "Now get out of here." The man staggered to his feet, clearly realizing he was no match for Jack and his crew. He looked at his men, who had already begun retreating, realizing they had lost. With one last glare, he turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness. Jack's breathing was heavy, his muscles aching from the fight, but they had won. They had made it through. Vince turned to Jack, his eyes filled with relief. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Jack nodded, looking at the woman. She was still weak, but she was alive. "She's going to be fine," Jack said, his voice firm. "We're getting her out of here." The crew gathered around, ensuring they were all accounted for before moving forward. Jack knew the worst wasn't over, but for now, they had won. They had protected the woman and kept their promise. As they made their way out of the alley, Jack glanced back one last time at the town they had fought to protect. The storm wasn't over, but they had weathered the worst of it. For now, they were safe. For now, they had won. The night had taken on an eerie silence as Jack and his crew moved through the shadowed streets, the only sound being the crunch of gravel underfoot and the faint hum of their motorcycles in the distance. The woman they had just rescued was still unconscious in Vince's arms, her body limp and pale, but the crew kept moving forward, knowing that time was against them. Every minute spent out in the open was another chance for their enemies to regroup and hunt them down. Jack could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone, and to that little girl who had begged for help. He wasn't about to let anything, or anyone, stand in the way of keeping her safe. As they neared Ridge Road, the air grew colder, the dark woods surrounding them casting long shadows. Jack could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. His crew kept a steady pace, moving swiftly but quietly, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. There was still no word from the rest of the town. They had no idea how big this threat was, but Jack knew they couldn't keep running forever. They needed answers. They needed to find out who was behind this, and why. They reached the cabin after what felt like an eternity, its weathered exterior standing stark against the dark sky. Jack motioned for the others to stop, and pulled the key from his pocket. The place had always been a refuge for the Iron Wolves when they needed to lay low, a safe haven in times of trouble. Jack opened the door, and they all stepped inside, the dim glow of the lanterns casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and dust. Vince gently laid the woman on the small cot in the corner of the room, his hands still trembling from the intensity of the fight. She'll be okay, Vince said quietly, his voice hoarse from the battle. Jack nodded, but the worry in his eyes was undeniable. She needs to wake up. We need to get her story, and fast. They had made it to safety for now, but Jack knew that safety was temporary. They weren't going to stay hidden here forever. Vince stood up, running a hand through his hair. You think they'll find us here? Jack took a slow breath, his eyes fixed on the woman as she slowly stirred, her eyelids fluttering. I don't know, but we'll be ready for them. The rest of the crew gathered around, their expressions hard. They were all thinking the same thing. This wasn't over. The enemy was still out there, and Jack had no doubt they would come looking for the woman. As the minutes ticked by, the woman's breathing became more even, and her eyes finally opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, but when she saw Vince standing beside her, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. You're safe, Vince said softly, trying to reassure her. But the woman's face twisted in pain, and she gasped, her hand reaching for her head. Where am I? She whispered, her voice weak. Jack moved closer, his voice firm but gentle. You're safe. We brought you here to keep you safe. The woman's eyes darted around the cabin, her brow furrowing as if trying to make sense of everything. The men, they're after me, aren't they? Her voice was barely audible, a tremor of fear still present. Jack nodded slowly, his expression hardening. Yes, but we're going to make sure they don't find you again. The woman's eyes filled with tears. I don't know who they are. I don't know why they want me. Jack felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it down. We'll find out. But first, we need to get you some rest. You've been through hell. Vince turned to Jack. What's the plan? Jack looked out the cabin's small window, the dark forest stretching endlessly in front of them. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. We wait until morning. Then we make contact with our people. We need to get more intel on who's behind this. We can't risk going in blind. The woman, still disoriented, looked at Jack with a mix of gratitude and confusion. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. Jack met her gaze, his voice steady but with a hint of sadness. Because you deserve better than what they've done to you. And because I promised I'd protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The woman nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. Jack shook his head. You don't have to. Just stay safe. That's all that matters. As the night wore on, the cabin grew quieter, the tension still hanging in the air like a thick fog. Jack kept watch by the window, his mind racing. Who were these men? And why was the woman so important? He had a feeling they weren't the only ones after her. As the wind rustled through the trees outside, Jack knew one thing for sure. They had just entered a much bigger fight than they had ever imagined, and they would need to be ready for whatever came next. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, Jack stood by the window, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. The night had been tense, every noise amplified in the stillness, and the weight of what they had narrowly escaped hung heavily in the air. The woman, now fully awake but still weak, lay on the cot in the corner of the room. Her face was pale, but the fire of determination was starting to return to her eyes. Vince had been sitting by her side throughout the night, keeping watch as best he could, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. Jack's mind was racing. They had barely escaped from the warehouse, and now, here they were, holed up in this cabin, hoping for some semblance of safety. But he knew that wasn't the reality. The men who had been chasing her weren't just going to give up. They'd be back, and probably sooner than they thought. Jack looked at the rest of the crew, his thoughts already moving to their next step. They needed to find out more about who they were up against, who was pulling the strings. They couldn't keep running forever. All right, Jack finally said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We've waited long enough. We need to find out who's behind this. Vince nodded, his gaze sharp. You think they're already looking for us? Jack didn't hesitate. Without a doubt. They won't stop until they get what they want. He turned to the woman, who was now sitting up, her face still clouded with fear, but now tinged with a sense of resolve. What's your name? Jack asked softly, his tone gentle. The woman looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Amara, she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. Amara, Jack repeated, nodding. We're going to get to the bottom of this. But first, we need to know everything you can tell us. Who are they? Why are they after you? Amara hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was searching for the right words. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know who they are," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen them before. But I know they've been watching me for weeks. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but then they started showing up at my job, at my apartment, always lurking in the background, always watching." She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know what they want, but I'm scared. I think they're after something I don't even know about." Jack listened intently, his mind turning over the possibilities. Whoever these people were, they had been planning this for a while. Amara was right. They weren't just random criminals. There was something bigger at play here, something more dangerous. Jack turned to Vince. "We need to get in touch with the others. We need backup." Vince nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll get on it." Jack turned back to Amara, his expression softening slightly. "Listen, we're going to protect you. But we need to move fast. Do you know where they might be holding more information? A place where we could get answers." Amara's face tightened with anxiety. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a place," she said, her voice low. "An old building, abandoned. It's not far from here. I used to work there. I've heard them talking about it. That's where they keep things that could hurt people." Jack stood up, his decision made. "All right, we're going there. We're not leaving until we know exactly who we're dealing with." The rest of the crew began preparing, their movements quick and deliberate. They were ready to move, but Jack could sense the weight of the unknown ahead. They didn't know what they'd find at that building, but they couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Vince, keep Amara safe. We'll go in and get what we need," Jack said, his voice steady. Vince gave a quick nod, making sure his weapon was within easy reach. "We're not going to let anything happen to her, Jack." Jack's eyes lingered on Amara for a moment, before he turned to lead the way. As they stepped outside into the cool morning air, the tension was palpable. The quiet of the early morning was broken only by the sound of their boots crunching on the dirt road. Jack's mind was focused on one thing, getting answers. The old building Amara had mentioned loomed in the distance. It wasn't much, just a broken-down warehouse, long abandoned, with shattered windows and a rusted gate that creaked in the wind. It looked like the perfect place for their enemies to hide in plain sight. As they approached the building, Jack's heart began to race. They were close, but the danger was only growing. "Stay sharp," Jack said to the crew, his voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into." The rest of the crew nodded, weapons at the ready. Jack's instincts told him that this was no ordinary mission. They were about to uncover something much darker than they could have ever imagined. The door to the building was ajar, and Jack motioned for the crew to move in silently. They entered slowly, every sense on high alert. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the hollow space. As they moved deeper inside, the faint sound of voices reached their ears. Jack held up a hand, signaling for everyone to stop. The voices were coming from a room at the far end of the building. They were close. Jack felt a surge of adrenaline as they closed in on the source of the voices. Whatever was inside, whatever answers they were about to find, would change everything. Jack's heart was pounding as they approached the door to the room where the voices were coming from. The crew moved in close, their footsteps nearly silent on the old, creaky floorboards. Every sense was heightened, every shadow, every rustling sound felt like a threat. Jack could feel the tension building as they neared the source of the voices. His mind was racing. What would they find in that room? Who were they dealing with? They had already learned that the people chasing Amara were no ordinary criminals. There was something far more dangerous at play here. The door to the room was cracked open just slightly, enough for them to see a sliver of light spilling through. Jack motioned for everyone to stop and pulled his knife from its sheath, holding it at the ready. The rest of the crew followed suit, their weapons drawn. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to catch any details from the conversation. The voices were faint, but he could make out a few words. "She can't keep hiding forever." The voice was low and menacing, filled with an anger that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "We'll find her. We know she's here. She won't escape." Jack's pulse quickened. They were talking about Amara, no doubt. The way they spoke, so sure, so confident, told him that they had been tracking her for some time. But who were these people, and why were they so determined to capture her? "We need to move fast," Jack whispered to his crew, his voice barely audible. "Get ready. We breach on my signal." The tension in the air was suffocating, but there was no turning back now. They had come this far. They had to press forward, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of danger. Jack pushed the door open slowly, just enough to slip through. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they saw the figures in the room. 3 men sitting around a table, talking quietly, unaware of their presence. They were all dressed in dark, nondescript clothing, their faces obscured by shadows. The moment they stepped into the room, the tension in the air shifted. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the newcomers. "What the hell is this?" one of them shouted, his hand reaching for a weapon at his side. Jack didn't hesitate. In a flash, he was on him, knocking the gun from his hand and slamming him against the wall. The other 2 men scrambled to their feet, but Jack's crew was already on them, moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. "Stay down," Jack barked at the men, his voice full of authority. "We're not here to fight. We're here for answers." The man Jack had pinned to the wall struggled against his grip, but Jack wasn't letting go. He could feel the man's pulse racing beneath his hand. "Where is she?" Jack demanded. "Who are you working for?" The man gritted his teeth, refusing to answer. Jack tightened his grip, his patience thinning. "Tell me, and I'll let you walk out of here." The man's eyes flickered to his companions, then back to Jack. Finally, he spat on the floor. "You think you can just come in here and take what you want? You're not getting anything." Jack's frustration flared, but he kept his cool. "We're not leaving without answers. Where is Amara's mother?" The man's lips twitched as if he was about to speak, but then his eyes widened. Jack followed his gaze to the far corner of the room, where a small monitor flickered to life, casting an eerie glow. A face appeared on the screen, pale and unshaven, the features twisted with anger. "You've made a mistake," the figure on the screen said, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed away." Jack's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something about his voice that felt ominously familiar. "Who are you?" Jack demanded. The man on the screen smiled cruelly. "I'm the one who's been pulling the strings. I've been watching you, Jack. Watching all of you." Jack's grip tightened on the man he was holding. "What do you want with Amara? Why her?" The man on the screen leaned closer to the camera, his eyes gleaming with malice. "She knows too much. She's been a thorn in my side for far too long." "But you," he said, his gaze shifting to Jack. "You're the one who's going to regret getting involved." Jack's heart raced as he realized they had just stepped into something much larger than they could have imagined. This wasn't just about a missing woman. This was about a network of dangerous people, and now they were all targets. "You'll never get away with this," Jack said, his voice low and filled with fury. The man on the screen only smiled. "We'll see about that." The screen went black, and the room fell silent, the tension now palpable. Jack turned to his crew, his mind already racing through the next steps. They couldn't waste any more time. They had answers, but they needed more. And they needed to get Amara to safety, fast. "We're leaving," Jack ordered. "Now? We've got work to do." As they moved toward the door, Jack felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The real fight was just beginning. And this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about taking down the people behind all of this, before they lost everything. The cold wind whipped through the trees as Jack and his crew moved quickly down the narrow dirt road, the weight of what they had just uncovered pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had gotten the answers they needed, but now they were faced with even more questions, and the clock was ticking. The man they had seen on the monitor, the one pulling the strings, had made it clear that they were in deep. They weren't just up against a small group of criminals. They were up against a well-organized network of dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Jack felt the tension in the air, a constant reminder that the danger wasn't just lurking around them, it was closing in. His thoughts were on Amara, the woman they had rescued, and what she knew. She had been a target because of something she had seen, something she had stumbled upon without even knowing the full extent of it. And now, Jack was determined to find out everything. He glanced over at Vince, who was still carrying Amara, her condition not much better than when they had left the cabin. "How's she doing?" Jack asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Vince looked down at her, his face tense. "She's holding up, but she's barely coherent. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere we can figure out our next move." Jack nodded. "I know. We're almost there. We can't risk staying out in the open for too long. Let's get to the warehouse and regroup." The warehouse they were headed to wasn't far, a place Jack had used in the past when things got rough. It was secluded, out of the way, and most importantly, it was secure. As they approached the building, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had been on enough missions to know when things didn't feel right, and right now, everything felt off. The familiar rumble of their motorcycles had died down, replaced by an unnerving silence. Jack's eyes darted around the area, scanning for any signs of movement. "Stay alert," he ordered, his voice sharp. The crew immediately fell into formation, their senses heightened as they moved closer to the building. They had made it this far, but Jack knew the real challenge was just beginning. As they reached the entrance, the door creaked open with a low groan. Jack motioned for Vince to go inside first, keeping his hand on his weapon. They had no idea what waited for them on the other side, but they couldn't afford to be careless now. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the echo of their footsteps on the concrete floor. Jack moved forward, his instincts telling him to be cautious. His eyes scanned the area. Empty crates, broken glass, and discarded equipment littered the space. But there was something else. A faint smell lingered in the air, a mixture of oil and something more metallic, something that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand up. He motioned for the crew to fan out, each of them taking a position around the room. "We're not alone," Jack muttered under his breath. "Keep your eyes open." The silence was suffocating, and the longer they stood there, the more Jack's unease grew. There was something wrong about this place, something that didn't sit right. He could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with tension. "What now?" Vince asked, his voice breaking the silence. Jack didn't answer immediately. He moved to the far side of the room, where an old filing cabinet sat against the wall. He pulled it open, rifling through the dusty folders inside. His heart skipped a beat when he found what he was looking for. Files, all labeled with numbers, names, and dates that meant nothing to him. But one name stood out among the rest. Amara, Jack whispered to himself. It was a single sheet of paper, marked with the same date as the attack on her. The handwriting on the paper was scrawled and messy, but the message was clear. Asterisk subject must be eliminated. Too much information compromised. Asterisk Jack felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just about the woman anymore. They had been targeting her, hunting her down because she had uncovered something important, something they didn't want getting out. He slammed the drawer shut, turning to face Vince. "We've got to find out who's behind this, and fast. They're after more than just her." Vince nodded grimly. "Agreed. But how do we get the rest of the information? We can't just leave with what we have." Jack's eyes flicked to the far corner of the room, where another door stood ajar. "There's got to be something more. Let's check that room." They moved quickly, but cautiously, as they approached the door. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest as he reached for the handle. The door opened with a creak, revealing a small room filled with monitors, wires, and equipment. The walls were covered in maps and pictures, all connected by thin red strings. It looked like a nerve center for whatever operation they had stumbled into. Jack's eyes darted across the room, taking it all in. There were files on the table, more documents scattered about, and a large computer screen flashing with information. He walked over to the desk, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "We need answers," he muttered. Vince stepped forward, his hand resting on Jack's shoulder. "We're running out of time." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. They were close now, too close to turn back. He sat down at the desk and began typing, accessing the computer files. The more he dug, the more he realized just how deep they were in. This wasn't just about a missing woman anymore. This was about a much larger conspiracy, one that had been hiding in plain sight. And Jack wasn't about to let them get away with it. As Jack dug deeper into the files on the computer, his fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard, the enormity of what they had stumbled upon began to sink in. Each new document, each new piece of information, revealed a web of deception and danger far more intricate than Jack had ever imagined. The names that appeared on the screen weren't just random criminals. They were high-ranking officials, powerful businessmen, and well-placed individuals who had been operating under the radar for years. The files contained records of secret meetings, financial transactions, and coded messages that painted a chilling picture of a massive underground operation. Jack's stomach tightened as he sifted through the data. This was no ordinary conspiracy. It was a network, one that spanned across states and perhaps even countries, with its tentacles reaching into law enforcement, government, and the business world. They had been tracking Amara because she had inadvertently uncovered a piece of this puzzle, a piece that they couldn't afford to lose. Jack's mind raced as he thought back to everything that had happened so far. The attack on Amara's apartment, the men who had been after her, the strange feeling that had settled over them since they first set foot in the warehouse. It was all connected. But the question remained, what exactly were they after, and how much more were they willing to do to protect their secrets? Jack, we need to move, Vince's voice broke. Through his thoughts, they'll be coming for us soon. Jack's eyes flicked to Vince, who was standing by the door, his expression tense. I know, Jack muttered, his voice low. He didn't want to leave this room, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. But he knew Vince was right. They had pushed their luck enough already. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the building, getting closer with every passing second. Jack's pulse quickened as he quickly saved the files, making sure they wouldn't lose everything they had learned. He wasn't sure if they would ever get another chance to access this information again, but they couldn't stay here any longer. Let's go, Jack ordered, standing up from the desk and heading toward the exit. The crew fell in line behind him, moving swiftly but quietly through the building. Jack's senses were on high alert as they made their way toward the back door. They had to get out, but there was no telling how many people were waiting for them outside. The silence in the hallway was deafening, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached the door, but as Jack reached for the handle, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from behind them. Don't move. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned slowly to face the man standing in the doorway, a gun aimed directly at him. The man was tall, his face obscured by a dark mask, but Jack could tell by the way he held the weapon that he wasn't just some hired thug. This man was trained. You've made a big mistake, the man said, his voice cold and steady. This is where it ends. Jack's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, and the element of surprise was gone. But he wasn't about to give up without a fight. We're not going anywhere, Jack said, his voice unwavering. We've come too far. The man's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement. You think you have a choice? He sneered. You're surrounded. The moment you stepped into this building, you signed your fate. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't let them take him, not now, not when they were so close to the truth. He had to find a way out. He glanced at his crew, their eyes locked on the man, waiting for his signal. The man's grip tightened on the gun, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. He had to act fast. Without warning, Jack lunged forward, knocking the gun out of the man's hand and sending him crashing into the wall. The other members of the crew reacted instantly, disarming the remaining attackers with brutal efficiency. Within seconds, the room was cleared, the attackers lying unconscious on the floor. Move, Jack shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. They couldn't waste any time. They had to get out of there before more arrived. They rushed through the building, making their way to the back alley where their motorcycles were parked. The engines roared to life as they sped off into the night, the cold air biting at their skin as they raced down the darkened roads. Jack's mind was still spinning from everything that had just happened. They had barely escaped with their lives, but they had also uncovered something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. They weren't just up against some local criminals. They were up against a massive, organized operation with resources and power far beyond anything they could have imagined. As they left the city behind, Jack looked over at Vince, who was riding beside him. What now? Vince asked, his voice tense. Jack didn't hesitate. Now, we take the fight to them. We find out who's really behind this, and we stop them. The road stretched out before them, dark and endless, but Jack knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. They had just begun the real battle. The wind howled through the trees as Jack and his crew raced down the highway, the sound of their engines echoing in the night. The city lights were far behind them now, and the open road stretched out before them, dark and endless. But the weight of what they had just uncovered sat heavy on Jack's chest. They were no longer just running from a group of criminals. They had uncovered a vast network of corruption and deceit, a web of people who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. Jack couldn't stop thinking about the man on the screen, the one who had been pulling the strings. Who was he? And why was he so determined to silence Amara? Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything they had learned. Amara wasn't just a random target. She had been part of something much bigger, something dangerous. He glanced over at Vince, who was riding beside him, his face grim and set. Vince had been with him through thick and thin, and Jack knew that his friend was just as determined to get to the bottom of this as he was. "We need a plan," Jack said, his voice sharp over the roar of their bikes. Vince nodded, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. "We can't keep running. We need to find out who's really behind all of this, and we need to do it fast." Jack's grip tightened on the handlebars, his thoughts already moving to their next move. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had to get ahead of the people hunting them down. The stakes were higher than ever. "I've got an idea," Jack said, his voice low. "We need to reach out to some old contacts. People who owe us favors. If anyone knows what's going on, it's them." Vince gave a brief nod, his eyes narrowing with determination. "We don't have much time. We'll need to move fast." Jack turned his attention back to the road, his mind spinning. There was no turning back now. They had already crossed a line. They had stepped into a world of shadows, a world where power and corruption ruled. But Jack wasn't about to let them win. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. The crew rode in silence for a while, each person lost in their thoughts. The air was thick with the weight of the situation, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead pressed on them all. But Jack knew one thing for sure. They couldn't keep running. They had to stand and fight. The next town came into view, a small, quiet place that seemed like the perfect spot to lay low. But Jack wasn't interested in hiding. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. As they pulled into a gas station, Jack cut the engine and dismounted. Vince followed suit, walking over to the payphone by the station. Jack took a moment to stretch, his muscles aching from the long ride, before heading to the store for supplies. He needed to keep his mind sharp. As he grabbed a bottle of water, he noticed a figure standing outside, leaning against a nearby car. It was a man, his face hidden under a hood, but something about him caught Jack's attention. The man's posture was tense, as if he was waiting for someone. Jack's instincts told him to approach cautiously. He didn't like the way the man was watching them. As he stepped outside, the man straightened up, his eyes locking onto Jack. Without a word, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper. He handed it to Jack, who took it without hesitation. "You're looking for answers," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I have information that can help you, but it's going to cost you." Jack's eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to trust this stranger, not without a good reason. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice steady but filled with suspicion. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around, making sure no one was watching. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows a lot about the people you're after," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But if you want my help, you'll need to make sure I'm taken care of." Jack studied the man for a moment, his mind running through the possibilities. They were on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. If this man had the information they needed, they had to take the risk. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice low. The man smirked. "Not much. Just a favor, when the time comes." "Do we have a deal?" Jack hesitated, weighing his options. But in the end, he knew they didn't have a choice. "We have a deal," Jack said, his voice firm. The man handed him the paper, then turned and walked away without another word. Jack stood there for a moment, staring after him, before turning back to Vince. "We've got a lead," Jack said, his tone serious. "Let's get going." They didn't waste any time. The paper the man had given them contained an address, one that Jack knew all too well. It was a place from his past, a place he never thought he'd have to visit again. But now, it was the only place that could give them the answers they were searching for. They mounted their bikes and sped off, the wind rushing past them as they headed into the unknown. Jack's mind was focused, his thoughts sharp and clear. They were getting closer, closer to the heart of the operation. And when they found it, they would destroy it. They wouldn't stop until they had the truth, and until they had put an end to the people who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack was ready. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it, no matter the cost. The sun had begun to set by the time Jack and his crew arrived at the address on the piece of paper. The small, run-down building was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, far from the bright lights and bustling streets. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned, a shell of what it once was, with cracked windows and rusted metal doors. But Jack knew better. This was where everything would come to a head. As they pulled up to the building, Jack cut the engine of his bike, his eyes scanning the area. The air was thick with tension. He could feel it in his gut. This was the place that would lead them to the heart of the operation, the source of everything that had been happening. The woman, Amara, was still with them, though she was in no condition to be involved in the coming fight. Vince had been watching over her, keeping her as safe as possible, but Jack knew it was time for them to finish what they had started. The crew dismounted and silently approached the building. Jack motioned for them to spread out, their movements quick and efficient. Every step was measured, every sound amplified in the growing darkness. They weren't alone, and they knew it. "This is it," Jack whispered, his voice steady but low. "Stay sharp. We don't know who or what we're walking into." With that, he led the way toward the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip inside unnoticed. The air inside the building was musty, filled with the smell of mildew and decay. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the dark hallways as they moved deeper into the building, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They reached a large room at the end of the hall, a space filled with old crates and equipment. And in the center of the room, a desk. Behind it sat a man, his back to them, his fingers drumming lightly on the surface. He hadn't heard them approach. Jack's instincts kicked in. "Get down," he hissed, and the crew dropped to the ground, moving into position. The man at the desk turned slowly, as if he had been expecting them. His face was cold, calculated. He didn't seem surprised to see them. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the man said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. Jack stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, his voice cutting through the silence. The man smiled slightly. "You've been digging into things that don't concern you," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "I'm the one pulling the strings, Jack. Everything you've seen, everything you've learned, it's all part of the plan." Jack's blood ran cold as the man continued. "Amara wasn't supposed to find out, but she did, and now, you're here, trying to stop something much bigger than you can imagine." Jack's grip tightened on his weapon, his jaw clenching. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." The man chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "You think you can just walk in here and stop me? You're already too late. The wheels are already in motion." Jack's crew tensed, but Jack held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. "What do you want with Amara?" Jack demanded, his voice filled with fury. The man leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "Amara is just a small part of this," he said, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling confidence. "She found out something she shouldn't have, something that could unravel everything I've worked for." Jack took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what's that? What's so important that you're willing to kill to protect it?" The man's smile faded. "The people I work for, they're not just after money. They want power, control, and Amara has the key to it all." Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just about the woman anymore. It was about a network of people, powerful people, who would do anything to maintain control. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. "Where is she?" Jack demanded. "Where's the rest of the information?" The man's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he didn't answer immediately. "You'll never get it," he finally said. "But you can try. It won't matter. The truth is already out there, and soon, everyone will know who's really in charge." Jack didn't wait for him to say anything else. With a swift motion, he lunged at the man, knocking him out of his chair and pinning him to the ground. "Tell me what I need to know," Jack growled, his voice low and menacing. The man struggled beneath him, but Jack's grip was unrelenting. "I won't let you win," Jack said, his eyes cold. "You don't have a choice." The man spat, his voice filled with venom. But before Jack could force any more answers from him, the sound of approaching footsteps filled the room. "We've got company," Vince shouted from the doorway. Jack turned just in time to see a group of armed men flooding into the room, guns raised. It was too late to retreat. They were surrounded. "Get ready," Jack said to his crew, his voice steely with resolve. They had come too far to turn back now. This fight wasn't just for Amara anymore. It was for everything they had uncovered. And Jack wasn't going to stop until they had taken down the entire operation, no matter the cost. The final showdown was about to begin. Discover the thrilling world of Hell Angel's stories in this gripping tale of betrayal, mystery, and danger. Follow Jack and his crew as they uncover a vast network of corruption, powerful figures pulling the strings, and a woman named Amara who holds the key to it all. The Hell Angel stories take you deep into the heart of this dangerous underground world, where nothing is what it seems, and trust is a luxury. As the stakes rise, Jack and his team must navigate treacherous paths to protect those who can't protect themselves, facing peril at every turn. Through intense confrontations and unrelenting action, the Hell Angels stories reveal the cost of loyalty, the search for justice, and the dark side of power. Join Jack, Vince, and the rest of the crew as they confront the truth behind Amara's secret and the web of lies that threatens to consume everything they've worked for. These Hell Angels stories will keep you on the edge of your seat, as every step closer to the truth reveals more danger and deception than they could have imagined. As they fight to bring down a powerful conspiracy, the Hell Angels stories showcase a fierce determination to never back down, no matter the odds.